Well, first of all, Jennifer, I want to thank you for your very nice introduction. Yeah, it's the history of the Quinnipiac people is a fascinating story that goes back really back into my childhood, growing up in Wallingford. Part of the fun of when we used to play cowboys and Indians is I always wanted to be the Indian, and so ever since I've been fascinated by the history and the culture of our local Native people. And being involved in the creation of the Dawnland Museum over at the Dudley Farm has just given me added impetus to sort of try to bring their legacy to life for people. So without further ado, I'd like to do a little presentation here on the Quinnipiac and their history. Most of the focus of this is going to be on the first 50 years or so of English colonization, which had obviously the greatest impact on the Quinnipiac people, as well as other indigenous people in the state. And I'll get into exactly what did happen to the Quinnipiac people at the end. So, but okay, here we go. I don't know how many of you people have a chance to go to the eastern side of New Haven Harbor, the New Haven area off of Townsend Avenue near Fairhaven. But there's a city park called Fort Worcester Park that's located actually on the original land of the Quinnipiac people. They had a village there. It was called Mayunkatuk. And also they had a fort actually on the hill up behind this little monument, and also there's a burial ground that is there. In 2003, through the generosity of some local donors, including the Townsend family, who owned a lot of the property around the park. As a matter of fact, at one point they donated the land to the city of New Haven. This monument was put up to honor the Quinnipiac people. And I like to start with this visual only because for me, I have mixed feelings about what it represents. You know, you see the three Quinnipiac people, a man, child, and a woman and their dog, of course, standing on the ridge, and the ship in the harbor coming into the New Haven harbor. And it says, a Quinnipiac Indian family walks to the harbor to meet the English newcomers, April 24th, 1638, as their way of life changes forever. And in a lot of ways, this tells the entire story, but in a lot of ways, it also sort of makes the story sort of nice. And the history of what happens to the Quinnipiac is a combination of both nice and really horrific. And that's sort of the story I want to tell you. But before I get into this, oh, I guess I should admit this person. I stole Lucy Ann Lavin's chart here from her book, Connecticut's Indigenous People, because one of the things when I go around the state talking about the Quinnipiac is I like to remind people that the Quinnipiac and their ancestors, like all indigenous people and their ancestors in Connecticut, were here for 14,000 years. And when you think about that amount of time compared to how European, African American, and Asian Americans have been, you know, in New England and in North America, it's just absolutely astounding to think that they've been here for that long. The longest period of cultural development and cultural existence was actually the time period called Paleo Indian, which, whoops, hey, I didn't want to go there yet, which Lucy Ann talked a lot about. And that is a time period that roughly in Connecticut went from about 14,000 years ago to 9,000 years ago. And that 6,000 year period is a time of tremendous environmental and climatic changes. And one of the things that I find fascinating about the people from the Paleo Indian time period is that they had the resilience and the ability to constantly change as the environment changed their culture. And it's mostly because of their relationship with nature. Of course, if we came to Connecticut, Madison, the Connecticut shoreline, all of Connecticut, Long Island, 26,000 years ago, this is what we would have seen. And I used to love to tell my students that, when I was teaching at Guilford High School, if we went outside and you look up into the sky 1 mile, that is how high the glacier was here that covered this area. And so obviously there were no people here 26,000 years ago. It's part of the Great Laurentian ice sheet that came down out of the Arctic and Canada. This map sort of is a fun little map because it sort of shows you the extent of which the glacier actually came. And that I used to kid people who I know from Long Island that Long Island is nothing more than a giant moraine pushed like a plow, like snow ahead of a plow, or ground ahead of a bulldozer by the glacier. And you can see the red sort of shows where the glacier actually sort of stopped about 26,000 years ago. And then interestingly, about 20,000 years ago, the glacier scientists are still sort of up in the air exactly as to why the glacier began to slowly melt and retreat. And this map sort of shows you the progression. So 17,500 years ago, here's the edge of the glacier, still covering most of Connecticut. 16,500, another 1,000 years, it's basically revealing the shoreline. And I like this map only because this shows the New Haven area right here today. Here's Guilford, here's Madison, here's the Connecticut River. And you can see this area became open with the edge of the ice sheet. And then eventually, whoops, my computer's a little sensitive here. Eventually, the glacier retreats up to 16,000 years ago. You have to start to have the formation of lakes, large glacial lakes, and Long Island Sound was actually Glacial Lake, Connecticut. And there was a waterfall in this area here where the race is now between Fisher's Island and the Northern Fork that actually was larger than the size of Niagara Falls in terms of size and volume. As of the glacier continued to retreat northward, you had the formation of a gigantic glacial lake called Lake Hitchcock that extended from the area, which is now basically Rocky Hill, Connecticut, all the way up just about into the Canadian, up to the Canadian border. Lake Champlain was actually a saltwater sea, Champlain Sea, connected to the St. Lawrence, the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And into this area came plant life, because the area that is now Connecticut during that time period was a tundra. And these beautiful tundra pictures here. And in this area also animals from a little farther south, in what maybe now New Jersey, et cetera, began to migrate up here in the spring and summer to eat. And these were large herbivores like mammoths, mastodons, buffalo, caribou. And as these animals arrived, guess who followed them? The first Paleo Indians. I have to show, this is my favorite picture. Don't ask me why. Okay, it's just, I love it because it shows that some mastodons, and I love to think about the fact that these things were once walking right through this area, right through downtown Madison, and of course, the buffalo, which is the only survivor from this time period here in North America, but other than caribou way up north. Now the first people to come into Connecticut, this is probably between 14,000 and 13,000 years ago, as I said, migrated in here seasonally with these animals. And then in the winter, they would tend to head back south again, only because of the climate was just too harsh. I love to show this painting only because this probably didn't happen unless a mammoth or a mastodon was actually trapped in a marsh and couldn't move, or what the, yeah, I don't think anybody in their right mind would run up in front of one of these and try to stab it, you know, as the guy in the front is with a spear. But they came up with strategies in order to be able to hunt large animals like this. Usually it was either to drive them into a swamp where they would get stuck and immobile, or drive them over a cliff where they would fall and die. So I know Lucianne mentioned the fact, I think in her talk, that that the site, Brian Jones Paleo Indian site up in Avon, has an indication of the possibility of a mammoth kill, I think she said. So there is also record in New York State of stone projectile points with mammoth bones. So we know in fact they did kill them. Incidentally, one of the arguments has always been is the humans came into North America and killed these off. It turns out instead it was the fact that they had a very sensitive digestive system, and the types of plants that they ate disappeared as climate warmed, and they basically starved and disappeared because of that. The other area that I know Lucianne talked about, going back to her chart here, is the Archaic period, which extended from about 9,000 years ago to about 3,000 years ago. And this is a time period of tremendous change, not only in terms of the climate and the environment in Connecticut, but also in terms of the people, because this is the time period when it's obvious that from archaeological evidence that people remained here in Connecticut throughout the season. And this is a time period when they developed a series of lifestyles that would propel them successfully throughout those thousands of years and into the woodland period. And so they developed family groups that would move seasonally from location to location. These groups usually were bands of people, 20 to maybe 50 people at most, that were also connected with other groups. There were a series of technological changes that took place over time, especially in regard to projectile points, because as the environment changed during the Archaic period, we started to have a climate that was very similar to ours. And with that, the large herbivores disappeared, and the types of animals that we have today, white-tailed deer, things of that nature, moose, in northern Connecticut were here, were the types of animals that you would have seen. So these people developed a system of maximizing their use of resources seasonally to survive and thrive. One of the biggest inventions or changes that made life really much more successful for the Archaic people was the invention of the addle-addle. And you can see here, the addle-addle is really simply a throwing stick to which you attach a smaller spear-like arrow, much larger than an arrow. This gave them tremendous they were able to get a tremendous amount of velocity when they used this, as well as accuracy, and it really revolutionized their ability to hunt. And for most of the time period with the Archaic period, this was the weapon of choice. Of course, they still had spears. And of course, here's some exciting little photos sort of showing about the domestic lifestyles that they would have thrived during the course of the Archaic period. Obviously, during this time period, it was we have evidence of them making dugout canoes and taking advantage of the water resources and rivers and ocean. Fish, clams, shellfish, etc., and harvesting of wild foods or wild plants were the maintain of their diet. But then about 3,000 years ago, you had another change in terms of culture, and that brought in the woodland period, which is the time period that we're talking about for the Quinnipiac and other indigenous people here in Connecticut. And that started about 3,000 years ago. and went up until the arrival of Europeans here in the contact period, which began around 1500, but then really changed dramatically in the early 1600s. This is a map that shows the major indigenous groups that were here in New England during when the Europeans began to arrive. Everything from Maine up here with the Abenaki, et cetera, down to Massachusetts with the Wampanoag, Nausetts, Massachusetts, the Nipmunks, and then Rhode Island with the Narragansetts, the Eastern Niantics. Whoops, here we go. Sorry about that. And then, of course, Connecticut with the major groups that you see here, which I'll highlight in the next slide. These pictures, by the way, also came from John Menta's book, the Yale professor, who wrote a wonderful history of the Quinnipiac people. I found that they were really useful when it came to doing a presentation. These are the tribes or the Indian groups, I don't want to really say tribes, that existed when the Europeans first began to arrive and documented them being here. And for our purposes, we're talking about the Quinnipiac and the Hammonasset, but also the Tunxis, the Wangunk, and the Paugussets, because these people, even though they were designated as different groups by the English and even the Dutch, they were all interrelated, and they shared a common culture actually with everyone else. The people of Connecticut were all Algonquian, and there was a lot of interrelation and intermarriage between all these different groups. And when the Europeans got here, the fun thing was for them is they tried to designate people by where they were located. So the Quinnipiac, of course, became known as the Quinnipiac because when they were asked who they were, they said, we're the people of the Long Tidal River. And of course, in their language, that's Quinnipiac. So they became the Quinnipiac. The people in Guilford were called the Monunkatuck because that's how they identified where they lived, etc. So, and I just like this slide too, because it's one of those little dioramas that somebody worked really hard on. It kind of gives you an idea in terms of what life would have been like for these woodland people during the time period. A lot of the information we know about their lifestyle actually comes from the Yale professor during the late 18th century. Ezra Stiles, who was a prolific diary and journal taker, and even though he was president of Yale, he was also the minister in Providence, Rhode Island. So he traveled back and forth between New Haven and Providence frequently, and as he went, he was a compulsive note taker of what he saw. And we know a lot about what we understand about the lifestyle and living arrangements of the native people in Connecticut during his time period because of the notes that he took. This is his diagram of a wigwam, or as the Quinnipiac called it, a witu in Niantic. And there's just another little picture to give you a better idea of recreation there. I love this because one of the things that people sometimes don't realize is they also built these very large longhouses that could sometimes hold as many as 20 to 30 people. This is a recreated one by the Iroquois. And it kind of shows you the living space inside with benches, etc. If you ever get a chance to go up where Lucian is, the Institute for American Indian Studies, they have a great example of not only the wigwam, but also the longhouse up there. And you can actually walk inside the longhouse representation. But for our purposes, what we need to do is talk a little bit here about, I got some people in the waiting room. Hang on, I think I'll let them in. Here we go. Oops. Uh-oh, never mind. When the first Europeans actually really spend time here in Connecticut, especially along the shoreline Connecticut, where the Dutch, who had first started to come to the area of Long Island Sound, and then obviously New York, and established themselves in Manhattan and Albany in the very early 1600s, 1609. I'm not sure how to get to these people to let them in, but one of the things the Dutch were really good at is making sure that they tried to document everything. And I'm going to try to zoom in on one particular section here, if I can. Oh, of course, the waiting room people are there. We go. This is the area of the Quinnipiac here. The Dutch called the Quinnipiac the Quirpies. And here, this is New Haven Harbor here. This is actually the Branford area. This is the Connecticut River. So you can see the area here that was documented. These are the Thimble Islands, which I'll talk about in a little while when it comes to the Quinnipiac, a very important sort of location for the Dutch. Here's another map the Dutch drew, and this is an interesting one because it shows their take on what they claimed is their land. They claimed originally from Cape Cod all the way down to Delaware Bay, which include New Jersey, all of what's now New York, most of New England here, including Connecticut. The red is the English and how the Dutch sort of interpreted the English possessions. Interestingly, they show the English claiming Long Island, which is not necessarily what happened since the Dutch colonized the western part of Long Island. Here's another Dutch map, and this one was drawn in 1662, just a few years before the English take over New Amsterdam and drive the Dutch out. And I wanted to just point out here that you see Guilford is called Guilford. Here's Totucket, which is Branford, which is the native name. We'll talk about that a little bit. Here's New Haven, Milford, and this is Saybrook, or Old Saybrook, which was an English holding. So this is the land of the Quinnipiac, according to the Dutch, even in 1662. Now, why were the Dutch here? Well, the Dutch were here because of that. They wanted to trade in beaver pelts and also otter pelts and other furs that they could bring back to Europe. The Europeans were in a fur drought because most of the fur-bearing animals had been killed off in Europe, and their only market where they could obtain them was from the Russians, which wasn't necessarily always easy for them. When they got here, the amount of furs that they realized that they could pull out of just the Connecticut River alone was just fascinating. I saw an account where the Dutch claimed that by 1630, they had brought out over 20,000 beaver pelts alone out of the Connecticut River. So why did the Europeans want these? Well, all the fashion in Europe at the time was men's hats. Men's felt hats made from beaver fur was all the rage, and the Dutch realized that they had a gold mine here in terms of trading with the native people for the pelts. The interesting thing about it is that the native people were all too happy to participate in this trade, because what they received in return were European goods, especially metal items, steel, knives. If they could get guns, they'd love to get guns, kettles, things of that nature. You'll see these things listed when I show you a couple of treaties. One of the fun things for me was back in 1998 and 99, I was working with John Pfeiffer, Dr. John Pfeiffer, who's your next speaker. And we on a nice February day, we decided to take a walk to see if we could find what was called a Dutch fort. Now, Ezra Stiles, as you can see a map on the left-hand side, Ezra Stiles had noted as he went, drew a map of Branford in the area called Indian Neck, which was an area where the native people had a reservation until the 1770s. He put a little X right here he noted it said Dutch Fort. And so John, many years ago, Dr. John Pfeiffer kind of redrew the map to sort of get a little better view of it. And we were lucky enough to actually find it. And we did a 2-year dig. We found a lot of different artifacts, pretty exciting, including the remnants of where the wall was, the remnants of where the bastion was, and remnants of a building that was in the center of the fort. As to how old this Dutch fort was, we really don't know. We had people doing research for us back in the Netherlands. It could be as early as the late 1590s. It certainly was there. It would have been there up until maybe the early 1620s, when the Dutch were really, really active in terms of trading with coastal Connecticut people, and I'll show you why. We go next. Here's just one of the modern maps, once again from John Menta, showing Indian Neck area today, a very nice area. If you have friends that have houses there, I mean, it's just a super place. And the Dutch fort was actually located right in this little area right here. What the English were looking for, I mean, the Dutch were looking for very early on when they were trading with the native people. They sort of played out the number of furs, the beaver and the otter furs that were available in Connecticut, but they realized that the coastal people from Rhode Island all the way down to New York Harbor made something that other native people wanted, and they were the wampum beads. Wampum beads were used for ceremonial purposes, as well as for identification and of who you were and where you were from and who your family was. And these beads were made out of quahog shells and whelk shells. And the Dutch early, by the 1620s, realized they could trade for these beads, take the beads here in Connecticut, and then take the beads and bring them up the Hudson River to the people like the Iroquois people, and also up into northern New England, the Abenaki and others, who would trade the beaver and otter hides and other animals for these beads. One of the most famous is they would make that native people would put together what are called wampum belts, and this is an example of one. This is honoring the creation of the Iroquois Confederacy in upstate New York. But they were highly desired by the all native people. So what the Dutch would do is they would trade with the coastal people of Connecticut for these beads, and then take the beads and bring them up north. Now this map, I know Lucianne showed you, this is the spice map that goes back to the 1930s in Connecticut. And this is when people were starting to get a little interested in who were these people who once lived here? Because for the most part, the people of Connecticut, including many historians, sort of assumed that the native people, for all intents and purposes, were gone. And they started to sort of go back into the older records of the English, both New Haven colony and then later Connecticut colony, and then the early state records, to sort of try to map out where in fact the different native groups were. And in this particular map, you see the Quinnipiac are sort of in the area near New Haven, extending up probably close to like the Meriden, Southington area. The Monunketuk, who were Quinnipiac, are set as separate people. And then you have the Hammonassets over here. And then the Wangunks, who were based in Middletown area. All these people, it now appears, according to more recent research, were Quinnipiac or related in a confederacy with the Quinnipiac. The Quinnipiac were also highly related with the Tunxus up in the Farmington Valley area, and the Wangunks here. So this whole group was sort of an interrelated sort of group. It was actually, in English, it was called the Wappinger Federation of interrelated native people. But we'll get more into that in a minute. This is a modern map. Sorry about that, folks. This is a modern map sort of outlining, it was put together by the colonial dames of America. I can't remember exactly when, sort of trying to indicate where the Quinnipiac were, missing a lot of it, but also including a lot of the towns which were the territory of the Quinnipiac, going all the way up to Meriden, Wallingford, North Brantford, and up into Prospect, Cheshire, in this area here, but they missed this entire area over here, like, Durham down through Killingworth, Madison, and Guilford. Now, what happened in terms of the Native American people, which began as a disaster pretty quickly on, is that once the English began to settle, unlike the Dutch, they were here to stay, and what they wanted was land. The Dutch were more interested in trade, and were willing to work with different native groups, and in Connecticut was mostly with the Pequot, in that trading network. Their whole goal was to pull the native people of New England and the rest of northeastern America into their global trading network that expanded all the way to Indonesia, India, parts of Africa, etc. The English, on the other hand, were coming here for different reasons, some for religious reasons, some for economic reasons, but their idea was they were going to come here to establish themselves. And the first colony, obviously, Plymouth, followed by Massachusetts Bay, then Rhode Island, and then you can see here in Connecticut, we had the Connecticut colony, which we'll talk a little bit more about, in 1635, and then the New Haven colony here. Now, what happened in regard to this is that the native people were sort of squeezed between the interest of the Dutch, the interest of the English, and the interest of their fellow native people. And that impacted many of the groups, none more than worse than, I think, than the Quinnipiac. In 1633, a horrible smallpox epidemic struck the native people of Connecticut here. And what happened as a result was they had no defenses against it. I know Lucienne mentioned it in her talk as well. It continued on until the next year, 1634. And by the end of that 2-year period, about 80% of the native people in Connecticut had died. And I know we've all talked, she mentioned it as well, how we're dealing with COVID and how horrific it's been and difficult for us. But can you imagine when in 2 years, 8 out of 10 people are died, and the trauma and the economic and political and social disruption must have just been absolutely phenomenal. The Quinnipiac, according to historians and who have gone through a lot of the records, their population dropped from about 3,000 people, it's estimated, to around 400 to 500 people. So you can see how incredibly devastating that 2-year period must have been for the native people. Why it happened, we really don't know, other than the fact that it seemed to have started in the area around Windsor in 1634, 1635. Well, let me back up. In 1633, the Dutch had established a trading house in the area, which is now Hartford, called the House of Hope. And the following year, or later that year, the people from Plymouth actually established a trading house in what is now Windsor. And then in order to sort of one-up the English who had gone up the river from them to try to capitalize on the trade of fur coming down, the Dutch went up even higher, up to maybe about where Enfield is today. And somehow smallpox broke out there, and it spread like wildfire. Whether it was the English fault or the Dutch fault, nobody really knows. Of course, the English blamed the Dutch, but it had a devastating effect on the people here, no matter which group. The other really devastating thing that took place, sorry, this slide's a little blurry. That took place that really made a big difference was the Pequot War. The Pequot War started between the Massachusetts Bay and the Pequot over the killing of two English traders who wanted to trade with Native Americans. One was a notorious man by the name of Captain Stone. But what happened was the ministers of Massachusetts Bay counseled the magistrates there to say that you can't not allow Native people to kill Englishmen and spill English blood without retribution. You can't allow that to happen. And so the English from Massachusetts Bay actually attacked, first they attacked Block Island, the Native American people there, because of the killing of one of the English traders. And then they attacked an English village, Pequot village in the area where the Pequots lived. And then they went to Fort Saybrook, which had been established by the English in 1635, and then they went home. Now, what happened as a result is the Pequot decided to seek revenge against the English, and they besieged Saybrook Fort for 7 months. The English commander, Lyon Gardner, had about 20 men. He was, luckily they survived the siege, so very often surrounded by anywhere from 100 to 300 Pequot. But not to get into the whole war, eventually what happened is the English were able to, they attacked the Pequot at Mystic Fort and devastated, a devastating attack that killed anywhere estimated 400 to 800 people. The surviving Pequot tried to flee to New York, to New Amsterdam and the Dutch, and also to their Mohawk. They were caught in what is now Fairfield. There was a 2-day battle, and the Pequot men negotiated the women and children being released out of the before the battle continued. The English said fine, and then captured them all and enslaved them and sent them to Bermuda and the Bahamas. The men broke out and were able to actually get away. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is because during the Pequot War, the Quinnipiac, who lived in this area, had been tributaries to the Pequot, but did not want to join them in the war against the English. And they actually, a majority of them actually fled up here to live amongst the native people who were living next to the Hartford, Windsor, Wethersfield. And they got to see the advantages of living next to the English, because for trade purposes, which was really important. And this is just another slide. I'll move on with that one. That's more exciting. Now, after the war was over, after the war was over, one of the things the English had done as they chased after the Pequot is they had gone through along the coast and stopped at New Haven Harbor, and they said, "Hey, this is a great place. We love this. This is a wonderful harbor. The native people seem to be friendly, the few that were there." And so they had made a decision that they were going to. It was a good place to settle. At that time, there was a group of English colonists who had just arrived in Massachusetts, the Boston area, under the leadership of Eaton and Davenport. And they committed themselves to sailing there and setting up a colony. They envisioned this wonderful merchant colony that they would have there. And in 1638, when they arrived, in 3 ships, 500 people, they immediately outnumbered the Quinnipiac people who were there at the time, and they negotiated what they considered to be a treaty, and the Quinnipiac assumed it was an agreement to actually settle in what is now New Haven, on New Haven Harbor. And they negotiated a settlement with Mawagin, who was the chief sachem of all the Quinnipiac, who was the sachem of the village of Myunkatuk, which was on the eastern shore of New Haven Harbor. I think if I could move you, I wish I could move you guys so I could see this on the slide a little bit. But what happened was the treaty was worked out, and this is exactly what would happen time and time again. The treaty was worked out in an English manner, based on English law, and based on the concept of English property rights. And one of the things that the English wanted to make sure that they got down in writing was the fact that they wanted to know who owned this land, who controlled the land, and who had the right to give the land up. Now, of course, Native American people, especially, and the Quinnipiac are among them, had no concept of land ownership. They did have the concept of land use, and their concept is that of sharing the land as opposed to owning the land. And when they made the agreement with the New Haven people, what became the New Haven colony, their concept was that we would be sharing this land together and living together in harmony. They wanted something that was really, really important. Oh, by the way, the interpreter for this treaty was a guy by the name of Thomas Stanton, who was originally from Massachusetts Bay, had been involved in the siege at Saybrook Fort, and he was a notorious, I don't want to say Indian hater, native hater, but he had a very, though he could speak Algonquin, he had a very low opinion from what I can tell, of Native people, and he was the interpreter. So what exactly he told the Quinnipiac people when the treaty was agreed to, nobody really knows. Now, what happened here was that, let's see, I wish I could get you guys out of the way here. But anyway, this slide sort of is the language of the treaty. And what the Native people wanted to make sure, the English people wanted to make sure, and you can see it there, it says that Mawagin is the sole owner of this land, and he is the only one who can dispose of that. Now, this is contrary to the way in which Native people operated. The English were treating Mawagin like he was a king, or he was a nobleman from Europe who controlled land as his hereditary right. That wasn't the way the Quinnipiac and other people looked at land, obviously. But this is what the English had insisted on, and this is what the English wrote down. They wanted to make sure they had in writing that Mawagin said he was the sole independent power that would allow to be able to turn this land over, and that any other claims by any other natives were moot. They also had to deal with Shampashu. Now, Shampashu was his sister, but she was also the sachem of Mononkatuk or Guilford, and one of my personal heroes, by the way, for a number of different reasons. But she claimed that she also had a right to this land, and so they had to write down the fact that he would that she was allowing them also to take the land. But she also included in the treaty the fact that one of the reasons why they wanted the English to settle amongst them was because they saw the benefits of living next to the English. So they were terrified of the Mohawks. They had been terrified by the Pequots. They were already getting hassled by by Mohegan, the Mohegans under Uncas. And they wanted the protection of the English against all their enemies and the benefits of living next to the English in terms of trade. So to the Quinnipiac at this point in 1638, they saw this as a beneficial deal, something that would really work out well for them. As long as they ended up doing what the English wanted, which turned out to be really interesting. In the treaty, it states explicitly that the English had the right to free access to all fishing and all hunting, that the English had free access to all the meadows, that means that the non-wooded areas, that the English had the free ability to cut timber wherever they wanted, and they also had the free ability to let their livestock roam unfenced. Now, this becomes a real problem for the Quinnipiac and then other Quinnipiac groups later. The Quinnipiac, on the other hand, had to agree to reside on 1,200 acres on the eastern side of the harbor. They had free access to their traditional lands from New Haven Harbor to the mouth of the Connecticut River, which means they're free to roam, hunt, et cetera, there, you know, wherever they would gather food, wild plants. They can hunt and set traps anywhere they want, as long as they don't harm, the traps don't harm the English livestock. They also explicitly could not interfere with the English fishing weirs that the English were setting up thanks to the help of the Quinnipiac. And they also could not enter the English town on Sunday, the Sabbath, or the houses without permission. This entering the houses without permission was something that drove the English absolutely crazy, because according to the Quinnipiac, everyone, you know, you have a wigwam, but of course anybody has free access to come and go as they want. That was just part of their culture, and they couldn't quite understand why the English didn't like them walking in on them while they were having their meal or whatever. And they would come in and sit down at the table, and it was really very unnerving for the English in New Haven. But you can see with this treaty that already in 1638, the English were putting restrictions on what the Quinnipiac could and could not do, where they could go, and et cetera. And as time went on, the restrictions only grew. Now, here's a map from John Menta, once again, showing the Quinnipiac Reservation on the eastern shore of New Haven Harbor. Here's New Haven Village, New Haven. This shows you the 1,200 acres that the Quinnipiac agreed that this would be where their main village was. So of course, from the Quinnipiac point of view, they felt that they could roam all the lands where they once roamed for hunting and things of that nature, fishing anywhere they wanted, because that was part of how they saw the agreement. The English, on the other hand, as time went on, even in the later 1600s, were spreading out quickly into these areas all around the reservation and taking the area over as farmland. And this started to create a real problem for the Quinnipiac. The other big problem for the Quinnipiac was the fact that the English refused to fence in their livestock, and their cows and their hogs in particular would wander into the Indian native reservation and eat their corn, and the hogs would dig up the clams and the clam bakes and the beds, and they were always kind of problems. The Quinnipiac dogs would sometimes kill the livestock, which of course drove the English crazy, and they would always want payment for the loss of their livestock. Whoops. Here's another exciting little tidbit from Ezra Stiles. As he wandered into their reservation, he noted down where the Native American fort had been, which is now in Fort Worcester Park. He described where it was in the burial ground, etc. Eventually, the English built a fort there, and there's a big battle fought there during the American Revolution. So by the time 1640-ish or so, the Quinnipiac are sort of isolated into 4 basic areas. You have the main one here in East Haven, New Haven. You have Monte Weiss and his very small band of people in North Haven. You have the Mononkatuk under Champlain here in Guilford, and then you have the Indigenous Totucket people here. This is a copy of the treaty of the English purchasing what is now Guilford, Mononkatuk, and this is in the handwriting of Henry Whitfield. This is Champlain's mark, the bow and arrow here. I used to make my students try to read this thing, which was just absolutely wild, but it was a lot of fun to get to see what they would come up with. But one of the things that's interesting about this agreement was that the English were really focused on where exactly are you talking about here? And so under direction from the Totucket sachem, Henry Whitfield actually drew this map, and this is the first map ever drawn by a Native American. Here's Monunketuk, where the main native village in Guilford was. Here's Faulkner's Island. This is Tunxus Point here. Here's the Kudawal or East River, which we'll talk a lot about later on. And then you have, of course, the Hammonasset over here. The land that they purchased, according to the English, was from Stony Creek right here all the way over to the Kudawal. Okay, here's Totucket. This treaty is interesting because once again they go through the whole English thing of making sure that Champlain says that she is the sole possessor of this land, and that all the other native people that are with her, all the other Monunketuk, agree that they are, and that they will remove themselves from what is now Guilford and go over to what is now Madison across the East River, which was the Kudawal, and live there. And in return, these are the items that they received. 12 coats I can't really see that there, but you can see they have glasses, shoes, wampum, hose, kettles, knives, hats, porringers, coats, etc. These are items that the Monunketuk and the native people in general wanted. One of the things that people misunderstand nowadays when they look at these treaties is the fact that the native people were a mobile society. They lived seasonally along the shore or along rivers, and they went inland in the winter and they moved back and forth. They didn't need possessions. They didn't want possessions. And as a result, they wanted things that they found useful. And these were the things that they found useful. They also saw these as gifts, not as payment, as opposed to the English, who saw these types of items as payment. At least it's come down historically as such. Henry Whitfield, the leader of the Guilford people, actually wrote down the names of the men who were there in Guilford at the time. And it's remarkable to realize, when you look at this list, there are very few complete families. And then the other thing is that there are only 33 people at all, 13 men, 8 women, 12 children, 33 people. This is from a village that probably was anywhere from 150 to maybe 250 prior to the smallpox epidemic. So you can see for the people of Monunketuk, they thought maybe this was going to be a good deal for them to live next to the English. They moved themselves over here to the east of the Kudawal, and it shows Champlain over here, and we'll get back to that in a minute. So once again, you have the 4 villages with Champlain here in what is now Madison. You have the Totucket people at Indian Neck, Mowagan, and Monte and North Haven. What happened was the Whitfield made sure that once again, legally, that in the agreement that the Monunketuk would remain and promise that they will always be friendly with the English and be very nice, and that they would not hurt any of the English livestock, etc. And if they did, they would compensate the English. But he also promised that he would compensate the Monunketuk if any damage was done to theirs, which of course would basically be their corn. And here's Ezra Stiles once again. Here's Guilford Village here. Here's East Guilford, which becomes Madison. Here's the Kudawal or the East River. You have the Hammonasset River here with Killingworth, and then over here this is Saybrook. And he noted down with this A that this was where the native people used to live. This is the people of Monunketuk who moved. Now, when it comes to Madison, it's an interesting story because obviously, and I think, and Lucienne talked about this, that the Hammonasset appeared to have been a sachendom of the Quinnipiac, but they are also related in turn through marriage, etc., with the Niantic who had lived along the mouth of the Connecticut River. But what happened was in 1640, as Lucienne had said, Uncas married the daughter of Sebasquash, who was the sachem in what is now Hammonasset or Madison. And through that marriage, he claimed that the land that was east of the Kudawo and between the Kudawo and the Hammonasset River were through his wife was the land of his son Anadin. And this is a map drawn by Joel Helander, the town historian in Guilford many different years ago. But this sort of shows you the area of the land that we're talking about, which is Madison today. Here's the Kudawo River. Here's the Hammonasset River. And Uncas was claiming this land by right of marriage. Now, meanwhile, Champlain and the Monunkatuck Quinnipiac were living over here. He was putting tremendous pressure on them to move away, and eventually they do. And when the English decided that they were going to buy the land from Uncas because he offered it to them, they went through all kinds of hoops and made him jump through all kinds of hoops to make sure that he was the sole owner and that he had no right to any of the land whatsoever, because they didn't trust him. And as a matter of fact, they actually made sure that he went and checked with the Quinnipiac to make sure that they no longer had a claim to the land. Now, Champlain and the other Quinnipiac gave up the land simply because they saw there was such a small group of them. They just saw it as not worth hassling Uncas, who was trying to exert his authority and control over all the native people, especially on the shoreline, but in southern New England. At this point, he goes on to fight 2 wars with the Narragansetts, for example. But one of the things the English make sure is that that Uncas and his men will not set any traps, do any fishing, or do any hunting in this land, that he would never use any of it ever again. Unlike the other treaties earlier on, they didn't want anything to do with Uncas. And they made sure that he checked with with Champlain and the Quinnipiac to make sure that they did not have a claim either. So interesting character here is also Weekwash, who was a Niantic, who had sided with the Mohegans and Uncas and the English during the Pequot War. They wanted him to check with him as well because of the Niantic connection. He was actually the first native person to sachem to become a Christian, and he was supposedly poisoned to death not too long after this. Getting back to Indian Neck here, I can't remember why I put this slide here, so we'll just move on. So by the 1640s, what was happening is the relationship between the English and the Quinnipiac really began to change over time. What was happening was that in the beginning, the 1640s, there was a real sense of mutual dependency. The Europeans, the English provided European trade goods. The Quinnipiac provided meat through hunting, wampum, furs, et cetera, and also they worked with them in terms of how to survive in the environment, and also acted as guides when they had to move around. The 1650s and 1660s, things began to change as the mutual dependency began to lessen. The English population was growing quickly. The native population was actually declining. And as the English population grew, they began to take over more and more land for agricultural purposes. And the Quinnipiac began to find that it was really difficult to maintain their traditional lifestyle of hunting and gathering that they had always depended upon. The other issue was that even though it was illegal, the English in New Haven and in Brantford were providing alcohol the Native American people, which was creating a real problem. A lot of the men had a real alcohol issue problem and would go into New Haven, for example, and cause all kinds of trouble, get put in jail, and then the Native people would have to, the sachem would have to come up with a way of paying to get them released from jail, which became a real burden. We'll talk about that in a minute. Also, during the King Philip's War in the 1670s, the Quinnipiac sided with the English against the Wampanoag and later the Narragansetts in the war, and actually fought against their fellow Native people on the side with the English. Yet the English in New Haven area and Brantford did not trust the Quinnipiac, and as a result, they were always looked at with suspicion, and as time went on, they were being looked at as an impediment to any kind of expansion, and they weren't needed economically anymore. So they looked more as a hindrance to the development of Connecticut as a colony, as opposed to any sort of resource or help whatsoever. And as a result, by this time period into the 1700s, the Quinnipiac and other Native people are becoming increasingly marginalized. And for the Quinnipiac, what happened was in New Haven and then later in Totucket or in Indian Neck, they had to, in order to function within the English economy now, they had to hire themselves out as laborers, or they had to sell land in order just to buy the types of things they needed just to survive. For example, the traditional clothing was no longer available made of skins. They had to buy English textiles, for example. And it became increasingly difficult for them to maintain themselves. And of course, with the English pressure in terms of population growth and acquiring land as they sell off their land to the English, they have less and less land to actually even grow corn. And so that gets us to what happened to the Quinnipiac. Well, a number of different things did in fact happen. That last slide, let me go back to that last slide if you don't mind. One of the issues was that the Quinnipiac tried to maintain themselves in Myunkatuk and on the east of the harbor and in Totucket. They maintained themselves well into the 1700s. Finally, the New Haven area, they sold off the last 30 acres in the 1730s. In Totucket, they hung in there till the 1770s. But many of the other groups, they just melted away and joined other Native groups throughout Connecticut and southern New England. The Schaghticoke, for example, in northeastern Connecticut are descended of people from many, many different groups. A small group of Quinnipiac, Niantic, Hammonassets actually settled in Westlake and North Guilford, and they remained there until the 1830s. There are also small bands of people in the northern part of Killingworth, kind of like up where Route 148 is. That area is very hilly and lots of ridges and forested, and not an area that was attractive to the English for farming purposes. And also they appear to have been small groups living in like the area around Rockland in Madison here. So a lot of them eventually though just started to drift away, and as my friend Gordon Brainerd would say, a lot of them actually kind of hung around and were hiding in plain sight. They just sort of drifted, kept their heads down, and kind of went about their business and remained in the area. Some of the survivors, eventually what they did, and I know Luciana talked a lot about this, so I'm not going to get into it much, but many of the New Haven and Totucket people eventually joined up with the Tunxus in Farmington here, lived there for a while before they moved up to Stockbridge and joined other refugee groups in West Stockbridge, eventually moving all the way to the Brothertown area with the Oneida and their fellow Stockbridge people. And then from there, then my map is kind of funky here, sorry, but from there they went, to upstate New York, and then eventually down through Pennsylvania, down the Susquehanna River, and into Ohio. by the 1800s, they were in what is now Green Bay, Wisconsin, which I hope you guys can see up here. Eventually they settled in this area where they are still today. There's a Brothertown reservation, and they also have joined the Oneida in that area. I've been working with a professor from Quinnipiac University. I've done some lectures over there for her anthropology class, and she has some students who are trying to contact people in Brothertown to see if they could actually locate descendants of the Quinnipiacs. As of right now, we haven't made any progress in regard to that. But one of the things that's interesting about the Quinnipiac is that people know the name, but people may not necessarily understand who these people were, and that's that's one of the things I'm trying to do. One of the interesting things about going to speak to students at Quinnipiac University is that the majority of the students had no idea where the name came from. Some thought it was from the river. They also are nestled against Sleeping Giant, which I'll get to, State Park, which I'll get to in a second. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, Americans kind of went through a romantic period where they liked using Indian names for things. It was kind of cool. This is it no longer exists, but it was the Monte Weiss house on Indian Neck in Brantford, which I think is kind of interesting. That I wonder, if these people had any idea that was once a Native American reservation there. The Quinnipiac were known for their exquisite basketry. Many of the people who hid in plain sight in the local communities became basket makers, and they were around in all the communities, Guilford, Madison, Killingworth, Brantford, well up into the 1800s, and provided baskets as a way of making a living. Here's Sleeping Giant, which of course now this field is where Quinnipiac University is. But the wonderful thing about Sleeping Giant is that the Quinnipiac believe is one of their main spiritual entities, Hobbamock, who was very important to them from the point of view of spirituality. It then took on the name Sleeping Giant, that's, most people don't know that's a sacred place for the Quinnipiac, and many Native people in Connecticut. There's a growing movement to recognize the legacy of the Quinnipiac. In 2003, along with that memorial stone, which I showed you in the beginning, there was a plaque put on by this large stone here, and over here on the left, on the right hand side, you can see it. The Quinnipiac used to gather around this large stone and have feasts every fall, sort of like a Thanksgiving feast. It was called the Council Rock. And even though they left this area, they returned all the way up into the early 1800s to have this celebration. The landowner would allow them to, until one time one of them got really drunk and I think killed either himself or somebody else by accident. And the homeowner said they can no longer gather there. It's now on private property. In somebody's yard, but the owner has allowed this plaque to be here, and people still coming and put little offerings, which is really kind of neat. It's it's also off of Townsend Avenue in New Haven, which is the area where the Myonkatuk was. Here at the Dudley Farm, we have our Dawnland collection, thanks to Gordon Fox Running Brainerd. He died in early 2021. He donated all these Quinnipiac artifacts to the Dudley Farm to establish the Dawnland Museum, Quinnipiac Dawnland Museum. He was a compulsive collector. We have thousands and thousands of artifacts from the area where the Quinnipiac once lived, from Clinton all the way to Milford and then up to North Haven and Wallingford. And there's just a little sign of the Dudley Farm there. It's currently housed in the loft of our Munger barn, which is actually a barn that came to us from Madison. It's the Munger lumber barn that was we took down with permission of the developer who built houses there and raised it back in 2002. But it's not a suitable area for us to have a permanent museum because there's no heat. It's difficult for people to get up the stairs, etc. And so we have recently been given a grant. We got a grant to build a new building and a grant to hire design and exhibit people. And we will be breaking the ground this spring to properly house our museum collection and tell the story of the Quinnipiac people. And we already have people coming forward from surrounding communities who have Quinnipiac artifacts who are interested in actually donating them to us. So we're planning to tell the story of the Quinnipiac from the time of the end of the Ice Age right up till today. And we owe that to our good friend Gordon Fox running Brainerd. It was his vision to do so, and we're carrying it on. So I think that's yeah. Oh, and as Lucy Ann did, there's still Native American people here in Connecticut. And this is a list of the 5 tribes. 2 of them are federally recognized, the Mohegans and the Manchitucket Pequot. But there are other people we know, and we're still trying to track down Quinnipiac if we can. So far, we have not been successful, but we want them to be part of our effort to establish the museum. We think it's really an important thing. So I want to thank you all very much for paying attention. And if there's questions or whatever, I'd be more than happy to try to answer them. So, and at this point, I guess, Astrid, you're going to have to tell me exactly how to do this.
Sure. So just put your cursor in the upper right-hand corner of my picture. And when you see the blue box with the 3 dots, click on that.
Yep.
And then make me the host.
Yes. Okay. Make you the host. There you go. Aha. Okay. Yes.
Okay. And then for everybody else, I know there's about 70 of us on this call. If you have a question for James, if you would put it in the chat, and then I will read it to James. And if there's a lot of them, I will do my best to get to all of them. So feel free to add your question to the chat. If you don't know how to do that, right on the bottom, there should be a ribbon on your screen with a chat feature, and you can just add it in. So James, the first question is, were there any Quinnipiac villages near Sleeping Giant?
There were probably seasonal villages. We know for a fact that the village of Monte, when the English came, was along the Quinnipiac River, but it was more in the area of North Haven that's called Monte today, and where Monte Avenue sort of dissects it. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the area. But there's certainly, if there were not permanent villages, there were probably seasonal villages, seasonal places for people to go there to take advantage of the resources there. We know that there were also some villages in Cheshire, as well as parts of Hampden. But by the time the English came, they were also they were temporary. It seems that by the 1630s, the Quinnipiac had sort of consolidated themselves into the 4 main villages only because of fear of attack from the Mohawk, who were coming all the way from New York State, and also their relationship with the Quinnipiac, with the Pequot, who they had to support with furs and wampum. So,
James, the next question is, all the maps list many tribes in Connecticut, yet there are very few listed farther north. Is this because of so many resources on the coast?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer there is yes. Most native groups tended to live along the coast and along rivers. So when you came into Connecticut, the Dutch and the English all talked about how many villages there were. Henry Hudson in particular And Adrian Block, when he sailed along the coast of Connecticut, marveled at the number of villages. And then as he sailed up the Connecticut River as far as Hartford, he remarked at the fact that there were so many villages and it was so heavily populated. Now, when you get to Western Connecticut, Northwestern Connecticut, we know that there were many villages of the Hammonassets and the Mohegan in Western Connecticut along the Housatonic River. And up in Northeastern Connecticut, that was the land of the Nipmuc, who still exist. And they have a reservation in Massachusetts, though they claim part of their tribal land is in Northeastern Connecticut. But most of the population of Native people at the time of the English and Dutch seemed to have concentrated along the coast of and up along the major rivers. And that also goes back to archaeologically into the Archaic period, when most of the archaic sites are located also along the coast and along the rivers.
Great. The next question. Has there been any DNA research done to help locate Quinnipiac?
Oh, we're dying to do that. We wish we could. I've talked to the professor I'm working with over there. Her name is Julia Giblin. She's an anthropologist, and we would love to be able to have that happen. If we can actually, the problem is, if we get, say, somebody from Wisconsin who would be willing to donate their DNA, who do we compare it to? You know, I think that's probably the biggest issue, but that would be absolutely wonderful. From what I understand, when Native American people today do do the DNA, it just sort of tells them they're Native American. That's it. It doesn't distinguish, like, you know, Europeans. Oh, you're French. You know, you're Italian. That kind of thing.
So the next question is: the Fairfield settlement had Stratford in 1639. My ancestor, Sergeant Francis Nichols, was charged with training the militia. What hostilities were there then?
In 1639, that they were worried about two things. They were worried about attacks by the Dutch. And if it was Stratford, that's definitely an area where there was contention between the English and the Dutch for control of that area. They were also worried about Native people who would be sent by the Dutch. In particular, the Mohawk had worked out a relationship with the Dutch very early on, and the Dutch would use them against other Native groups and also potentially against the English. So it was probably the Dutch and the Mohawk that they were probably most training for. Also in 1639, they were really, the Puritans in Connecticut were really worried that the English king was going to send forces here against them. There's a whole backstory to that, which I can't get into today, but a lot of the English settlements in Fort Saybrook and also Guilford were partly created because of the fear of Englishmen that they might have to leave England to come here. So.
Okay, then there's a question about the spelling of Quinnipiac, one that ends in a C and one that ends in a CK. Is there any difference between those two?
Well, not the CK. No, there really is no difference. The problem, the English, you know, our spelling of these native names are based on how the English pronounce them, and so you see them spelled in all different types of ways, not necessarily accurate. Even the name of our state, Connecticut, which is named after the river, from what I understand, was Quinnipiac, and of course the English weren't going to say that. That was too much. So.
Okay, the next one, we have some interesting ones coming up. Has any, forgive me, zooarchaeological work been done examining faunal remains to get a more refined idea of Quinnipiac's diets and foodways?
There's a very famous site in New Haven called oh gosh, I can't remember the last name. It's a hyphenated name, the Barrows Clocko site, I believe, where they've done a lot of work, and the faunal remains appear to have been of the same type that you would have seen throughout Connecticut. A lot of wild plants, seasonally based on what was available. A lot of they've been able to recover a lot of bones from animals that they ate, fish, things of that nature. So the Quinnipiac pretty much had a standard diet that probably was typical of all of the people of Connecticut. I know that site in particular, they did do a lot of work in regard to that. I'm sure there's others that I'm not necessarily right now aware of that I can remember.
So I'm going to combine two people's questions here. What is the importance of the Thimble Islands?
Oh, the Thimble Islands. Well, according to the Quinnipiac's myths, the Thimble Islands were created. There were two stone giants. One was Hobomok, who was sleeping giant, and his brother was named Mashup. His name is, and he is now located. That's why you have West Peak in New Haven. That's him laying down. But Mashup got into a argument with the native people, with the ancestors of the Quinnipiac, and there was an ongoing battle. And because he was a big giant, he had an advantage. But one day, the Quinnipiac and the ancestors of the Quinnipiac were able to actually drive Mashup away from the shore. He ran and then swam across to Long Island, where he started to pick up rocks. And he started throwing the rocks at the native people back here on the shore in Connecticut. And a lot of the big glacial erratics that you see hanging around, like even that last stone that I showed you where the plaque is, were supposedly thrown here by him. The Thimble Islands are also supposedly there because he threw those rocks that he was throwing at the native people here along the shore. So it's kind of a cool idea. The one other thing about the Thimble Islands, which is interesting, is that the one reason why the Dutch built their fort where they did at an Indian Neck was that it's partly protected from potential attack from the sea by other Europeans by the Thimble Islands. Because anybody who's ever tried to sail, with a boat around there, you got to be careful because there's a lot of submerged rocks.
Indeed. The next question: how can we ensure the native people of Connecticut are properly honored and recognized?
Oh boy, that's for sure. That's something that's a responsibility of all of us. The only thing that I'm happy to see is that there seems to be a growing awareness of the history of the native people and their culture, but also of the people who are still here. And I think one of the things we're going to try to do at the Dawnland Museum at the Dudley Farm is make sure that is what we do. We want to honor the history and culture and life of the Quinnipiac people respectfully and with dignity. And I think the more that we all sort of take the time to recognize the history, culture of the native people, and that they are still here, and what they have contributed to us and what they continue to contribute. That's an important thing for all of us to do. So when you hear somebody saying negative things about Native Americans, yeah, that can't be tolerated. I know I'm going to get in trouble saying this, but as a teacher at Guilford High School, since I began there in the early 80s, I always pushed for the mascot, the Indians, to be dropped. And I got a lot of pushback over the years for that, because I thought it didn't necessarily honor the legacy of the people who once called that home. And as many of you probably know, they've since changed it finally to a different mascot. So.
The next question: where is the Treaty of 1638 kept?
It's in the New Haven Colony Historical Society. They have it. So I haven't never seen it. I've only seen copies and translations of it. There are other treaties, a lot of other treaties as well too, which I didn't bother with here. There's one with Monte. There's one that buys not only what's now North Madison from Uncas, but also there's another treaty that buys what's now North Guilford. There are a lot of them.
The next one, the Madison Land Trust has a trail called Indian Rock Shelters. Do we know who lived there and when?
Well, rock shelters were used seasonally mostly by hunting. By the time you got to the woodland period, they were used by hunting groups, probably for temporary shelters. I know it's a rather large shelter, so it probably might have been used seasonally also by Native people in the past, even the Hammonasset Quinnipiacs, because they would very often spend winters in rock shelters, going back to the early archaic period, where they would create a shelter around the face of it so that they were protected by putting up poles and skins and things of that nature, and they would put fires inside to heat the stone, and they were relatively comfortable from what I understand. So it was probably a combination of maybe seasonal residents, people living there seasonally, as well as the hunting parties for sure.
Okay, and this next question, I've been leaving out the names, but this next question comes from Joel Helander, just so you have some background.
Joel, okay.
So he writes, you cited the mutual dependency in the 1640s between the English and Native Americans, but that this all changed in the 1650s and 60s. I think historians would like to believe that specific events require specific interpretations. Therefore, is it fair to believe that at the time of Guilford and Madison's resettlement under Reverend Whitfield, which was in September of 1639, that the native Menunketuk had far less need for their land than they did for trade goods and access to more, in addition to a need for security? And therefore, is it easy to believe that the English Puritans did not take advantage of the Menunketuk in 1639 when they acquired the land here?
I agree completely with Joel. I think what happened was, especially that's one reason why I showed the slide with the small population, the 33 people. I think they realized that there was a benefit to allowing the Whitfield Company to settle there and moving to the Kutuwo. That way they would have access to not only the English goods, but the fact that according to the agreement with the Whitfield people, they could still hunt, they could still gather shellfish, they could still fish, and they did so well into the 1700s. So I think they saw it as a positive as opposed to any sort of negative. I don't believe they were taking advantage of at all. I thought they were, it was a mutual agreement based on the needs of each particular group. I know that can be controversial to a certain extent nowadays, but I think, in all fairness, one of the things that I have always sort of admired about the Guilford people right from the beginning was that they always appeared to be incredibly tolerant of the native presence, not like maybe some other areas where they weren't so. And that's one reason why they remained up in Westlake for a long time area. And I just think I think there was a good relationship there, and I think one made based on the needs of each particular group.
And the last question here is, do we know if there was much prehistoric trade across Long Island Sound?
More than likely. I don't know specifically, but I can't believe there wouldn't be. I mean, when the English and the Dutch came here, they saw large dugout canoes made from trees that could hold as many as 20 to 50 men. The people of during the Pequot War, before the Pequot War, the Pequots and the Long Island people were going back and forth. I think it was basically just a paddle away. So yeah, I think there was a lot of trade, and there were also family relationships, I think, that were probably maintained as well between the coastal Connecticut and the Long Island people too. So yeah, I think there was a lot of trade and a lot of coming back and forth.
Okay.
Okay.
So that's it for all the questions. I did want to take a moment and thank everybody for coming. And James, thank you so much for such a wonderful lecture, very educational. Thank you all for all your great questions. I hope that we answered everything to your satisfaction. And I do hope that you join us for the next series, the next lecture in this series. James, if you have anything else to say before we close.
Well, I'm gonna be really shrill and sort of to push my book that I recently wrote called Shadows Over Dawnland. Actually, here's a copy here. It chronicles those 50 years from 1630 to about 1686 and the impact the English settlement had on the Quinnipiac people in general. And I wrote it as a historical novel so that I could try to flesh out a little bit more of the cultural impact as opposed to just a straight history. So it is available, I believe, once they get a new supply in at Breakwater Books, and also it has been available at R.J. Julia's, or you can go to Amazon or any other online sort of things. Yep, it's called Shadows Over Dawnland.
Dawnland, yes?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much. I hope everybody fared well in the storm yesterday, and I look forward to a great week, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.